Join us for a compelling story that begins with an unexpected act of heroism on a flight and transforms into a journey of self-discovery and change. Meredith Calloway's world shifts when Marcus Hayes, a stranger and respected judge, steps in to help her son during a mid-flight emergency. This moment forces Meredith to confront her own biases and sets her on a path that challenges her relationships and reshapes her understanding of empathy and community. What follows is a powerful exploration of growth, connection, and the courage it takes to change. How will Meredith's awakening impact her family and those around her? And what challenges will she face as she strives to turn personal realization into action? If you're inspired by stories of transformation and resilience, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Now, let's dive into Meredith's story and see where this journey takes her. JFK International Airport bustled with a symphony of movement and sound. Travelers hurried across the gleaming tiles, their steps echoing amid the automated announcements. In the calm of the first-class lounge, the atmosphere shifted to one of subdued luxury, where the chaos of the terminal felt worlds away. Meredith Calloway sat perched on the edge of a sleek modern armchair. Her blonde hair, perfectly arranged in soft waves, framed her angular face. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a cream blouse, both of which bore the effortless precision of someone used to presenting their best self. Her eyes flitted to her phone screen, where the schedule of their upcoming flight glowed brightly. "Mom, are we boarding soon?" Jake's voice interrupted her brief focus. He sat next to her, a teenage bundle of restless energy, his long legs sprawled out awkwardly. Jake's sandy blonde hair fell over his eyes, and he brushed it aside as he fidgeted with his tablet. "Almost," Meredith said, a thin smile breaking her otherwise composed expression. "Keep an eye on the announcements." Jake nodded, half listening as he resumed his game, the animated graphics reflecting in his wide blue eyes. Across the lounge, a man stood out, not for any grand gesture, but for his composed stillness. He was tall, with broad shoulders accentuated by a well-tailored suit that hinted at an understated affluence. His skin was the color of rich mahogany, and a pair of reading glasses rested on his nose as he read through a thick stack of legal documents. His briefcase, polished but worn at the edges, sat at his feet. The gold-embossed initials on it read M.H. Marcus Hayes. Meredith noticed him, a flicker of discomfort passing over her features. It was subtle, almost reflexive, and she pushed it aside without examination. The conversations at her book club, the whispered warnings over cocktails, these remnants of her past surfaced briefly, then faded as she redirected her attention. The boarding announcement echoed through the lounge, prompting a stir as people gathered their belongings. Meredith rose smoothly, her movements precise as she slipped her phone into her purse. Jake sprang up beside her, slipping his tablet into his backpack. As they approached the gate, the air felt electric with the anticipation of departure. The line for first class moved quickly, guided by a practiced efficiency. Meredith handed over their tickets with a polite smile at the gate attendant, feeling the slight rush of satisfaction as they were welcomed into the more spacious front section of the plane. Once seated, she took a moment to appreciate the plush leather and the muted glow of the cabin lights. Jake was already experimenting with the seat controls, adjusting the recline and extending the leg rest with a delighted grin. "Don't play with that too much," Meredith chided softly, a hint of warmth in her voice. She settled in and glanced down the aisle just as Marcus entered. He nodded at the flight attendant and slid his briefcase into the overhead compartment before taking his seat across from her. A fleeting wave of tension swept over Meredith. The man from the lounge was now her neighbor for the next several hours. She stole a glance at him as he unbuttoned his suit jacket and opened the book in his lap. He was composed, entirely in his own world, yet his mere presence pricked at an edge of Meredith's mind that she preferred not to examine. Alyssa, the flight attendant, approached with a bright smile, her tidy bun bobbing as she moved. "Good evening, Mrs. Calloway. Would you like anything before takeoff?" Meredith hesitated, then leaned in slightly, dropping her voice. "Would it be possible for that gentleman to be reseated? Maybe there's space in economy?" Her eyes darted to Marcus, who had momentarily paused, the corner of a page caught between his fingers. Alyssa's smile faltered for a millisecond before resuming its practiced glow. "I'm afraid all seats are full, ma'am. Everyone is where they should be." "Of course," Meredith said, heat rising in her cheeks. She turned back to her seat, the brief exchange weighing more than she expected. The engines rumbled to life, sending a soft vibration through the floor as the plane prepared to taxi. Meredith adjusted her seatbelt, glancing at Jake, who had already begun scrolling through the in-flight movie options. Marcus, meanwhile, sat calmly, his eyes focused on the open book in his lap, his face serene. Meredith stole another look, something unreadable in her eyes. The man carried an air of quiet authority, but her reaction to him nagged at her. It was irrational, and she knew it, but the feeling was there all the same. The plane's engines roared as it ascended, the lights of the city below turning into a quilt of twinkling patches. The transition from solid ground to the cloud-veiled sky was seamless, a moment suspended between departure and destination. The cabin fell into a gentle routine as the seatbelt signs dimmed and passengers began to relax. Drinks were offered, screens glowed with movies and news reports, and the faint hum of conversation rose and fell like a tide. Meredith's eyes fluttered shut, but sleep didn't come. Instead, snippets of memory played like distant echoes. Whispers at the country club, "You just never know who you'll run into in the city." The casual warnings voiced over polished dinner tables. The anecdotes that drew polite laughs but planted seeds of fear. Across the aisle, Marcus marked his page and placed the book aside, reaching for a folder with case files. The gold watch on his wrist caught the cabin light as he flipped through the documents, his brows furrowing in concentration. He seemed to sense her gaze, looking up briefly. His eyes met hers, warm yet inscrutable. He nodded politely before returning to his work. Meredith's chest tightened with an unfamiliar feeling, not quite shame, not quite curiosity, but a disquieting mix of both. Time passed in small, quiet increments. The sky outside darkened, deepening to an inky blue that enveloped the plane. The soft drone of engines and the occasional clink of glasses were the only sounds as passengers drifted in and out of sleep. Jake shifted beside Meredith, letting out a small sigh. She smiled faintly, brushing his hair back from his forehead, her maternal instincts surfacing in the quiet moment. But then his peaceful expression faltered. His eyes opened, wide and panicked, his chest rising and falling too quickly. He gasped, his hand flying to his throat. "Mom?" he choked out, voice barely more than a wheeze. Meredith's heart plummeted. "Jake!" Panic shot through her veins as he continued to struggle for air, his face paling by the second. The muted calm of the cabin shattered in an instant as her voice rang out. "Help! My son! He can't breathe!" Passengers turned, startled, their murmurs blending into a low hum of alarm. Alyssa rushed to Meredith's side, radioing the cockpit with practiced urgency. "I can help!" came a voice from across the aisle, cutting through the noise with calm authority. Marcus Hayes stood, already reaching for the medical kit Alyssa handed him. His movements were steady and confident, the room seeming to shrink as he knelt beside Jake. "Keep calm," he said, his voice deep and steady. He spoke directly to Jake, who clung to consciousness, eyes wild with fear. "We're going to help you." Meredith's vision blurred with tears as she watched Marcus work, administering an emergency antihistamine. The seconds stretched unbearably as she held her breath, willing Jake's body to respond. Finally, Jake's breathing eased, his eyes fluttering shut as he slumped back against the seat. The tension in the cabin released like an exhale, soft murmurs of relief breaking the silence. Marcus stayed beside him for a moment, checking his pulse, then met Meredith's eyes with a look of quiet assurance. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice catching. Marcus gave a small nod, standing and returning to his seat without fanfare, his presence both grounding and humbling. Meredith sat motionless, one hand gripping Jake's now steady wrist. Her heartbeat, once thundering, began to slow. The reality of what had just happened settled over her like a heavy blanket. The passengers around them resumed their own rhythms, the cabin noise returning to its former state with subtle, shared glances toward Marcus. Alyssa stopped by, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and something else. Something that looked like quiet acknowledgement. Jake's breathing steadied, and a faint color returned to his cheeks. Meredith closed her eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude and an uncomfortable awareness of the assumptions she had carried. Ones that Marcus had unraveled without a word. The flight continued, but the ambiance had shifted. There was a collective, unspoken recognition of what had transpired. Marcus, who had resumed reading, was no longer just another passenger, but a point of quiet reverence. Meredith turned to look at him once more, this time without the veil of her earlier discomfort. He caught her gaze and held it for a moment, eyes patient and understanding, as if he already knew the journey she had just begun. The cabin settled back into an uneasy quiet. Jake, now asleep, clutched the blanket around him with one hand. Meredith watched him, a complex mix of relief and lingering dread etched across her features. The cabin's dim light softened everything, turning sharp lines into muted shadows. Alyssa passed by with a reassuring glance. "We'll keep an eye on him, Mrs. Calloway," she said softly, her voice threaded with empathy. Meredith nodded, unable to form words. She shifted her gaze to Marcus, who was now seated again, the calm aura around him unbroken. He returned to his reading, seemingly untouched by the tension that still rippled through the air. But as much as Marcus seemed to brush off the incident, Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that the entire event had somehow shifted the axis of her understanding. Her earlier discomfort now gnawed at her, a silent rebuke she couldn't ignore. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, a gentle but sudden reminder of their suspended reality. Meredith gripped her armrests reflexively, the feeling of helplessness from moments before still too fresh. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead, illuminating rows of tiny lights that glowed like stars. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, and one or two sighed audibly, relieved as the shaking subsided. Marcus remained a study in composure, eyes scanning the legal brief in his hands. The way he carried himself, seemingly unfazed by both turbulence and life's unexpected disruptions, made Meredith's earlier assumptions feel even more unfounded. She closed her eyes, flashes of conversations from her past filtering in like an unwanted slideshow. The well-meaning warnings, the stories passed around her social circle that reinforced an us versus them mindset, all came back now, taking on a different tone in light of what Marcus had just done for Jake. A whispered conversation between two older passengers seated a row behind reached her ears. "Did you see that man step in?" "I heard he's a judge," one said, voice low but carrying enough to catch Meredith's attention. The other murmured in agreement. "Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many stories like his go unnoticed?" Meredith's chest tightened, the implications of the murmured words sinking in. The hours dragged on as the flight settled back into its rhythm. Jake stirred, his lashes fluttering before he opened his eyes, now clearer and no longer clouded with fear. Meredith's heart lifted slightly at the sight. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing his hair back. "Mom?" Jake said, his voice a little hoarse. "What happened?" "I remember not being able to breathe." "You had an allergic reaction," she said, the tension loosening its hold on her voice. "But you're okay now. Someone helped us." Jake's eyes, still heavy with sleep, followed her gaze across the aisle. Marcus glanced up at the attention, offering a subtle nod before turning back to his book. The moment was quiet but carried weight. "Is he a doctor?" Jake asked, curiosity slipping into his expression. Meredith hesitated. "No, Jake. He's a judge, a very important one." Jake blinked, taking in the information with a simplicity that only a child could. "He seems nice," he said, before drifting back into a light sleep. Meredith's throat tightened again, this time for a different reason. To Jake, kindness was simply kindness, unburdened by the filters adults attached to such things. It was an observation that, simple as it was, cut through her tangled web of emotions. The in-flight attendants began the breakfast service, offering trays of neatly arranged meals and small cups of coffee. The cabin filled with the soft clinks of cutlery and the low murmur of passengers easing into their morning routines. Marcus folded away his reading glasses and glanced out the window, the early light casting a soft glow on his profile. Meredith watched, wondering what it was like to be him, someone who carried the weight of justice but chose, in this moment, to act without question or hesitation. Alyssa approached with fresh coffee, pausing when she saw Meredith's pensive expression. "Would you like some coffee, ma'am?" she asked, her voice breaking the quiet connection Meredith felt with her thoughts. "Yes, please," Meredith said, accepting the steaming cup. She stirred it absently, replaying the image of Marcus leaning over Jake, his voice steady and confident. The discomfort from the lounge and the earlier parts of the flight felt like a distant, almost shameful memory. Across the aisle, Marcus noticed the look of contemplation on her face, but said nothing. The moments of silence between them were starting to feel less like avoidance and more like an acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding that they were navigating the same space, but carrying vastly different weights. As the breakfast service wrapped up, a man a few rows ahead turned and nodded at Marcus. "Judge Hayes, I thought I recognized you. My brother read your opinion on that landmark case last year. It was truly something." Marcus's lips curved into a polite smile. "Thank you. I appreciate that." The acknowledgement rippled through the cabin subtly, reinforcing his identity beyond just the man who helped. Meredith felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks as she realized how much she had misjudged him, how her first instinct had been to distance herself rather than understand. "Mom, did you know he's a judge?" Jake's voice, now stronger, pulled her back from her spiraling thoughts. He had been listening, and his eyes shone with interest. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, voice steadying. "I did." "He must be really smart," Jake said, leaning back as if considering something deep. "I want to be like that one day." Meredith's heart clenched, both with pride at Jake's innocence and a bittersweet ache at how far she knew she had to go to align her actions with the values she now saw reflected in Marcus. The remainder of the flight carried a new rhythm. Passengers whispered softly, some sharing their interpretations of what had unfolded hours earlier. Alyssa moved through the cabin with a quiet efficiency, exchanging glances with Marcus as if acknowledging an unspoken bond forged through crisis. Meredith took a sip of her coffee, the warmth grounding her. She felt the weight of years of assumptions, half-truths, and subtle warnings, pressing against her, demanding re-evaluation. How many other moments in her life had passed without her noticing the quiet heroism of those she was conditioned not to see? Marcus's posture remained unchanged, back straight, eyes on the file in front of him. Yet Meredith knew that this flight had shifted something between them, however imperceptible it might be to the outside world. The announcement for the descent crackled through the speakers, instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts and stow their trays. The cabin transformed from a space of quiet reflection back into one of activity as passengers prepared for landing. Jake was fully awake now, his color much improved. He grinned at Meredith, his relief evident. "Can we tell Dad about this when we get home? About how a judge helped us?" Meredith smiled, the knot in her chest loosening a bit. "Yes, we'll tell him," she said, her voice laced with both pride and something newly fragile, an awareness that she was on the brink of change. The plane's wheels met the tarmac with a gentle thud, signaling the end of their airborne journey. As the plane slowed and taxied toward the gate, passengers began to unbuckle and shift in their seats. The muted excitement of arrival filled the air, mingled with the remnants of what had transpired. Marcus glanced over at Meredith one last time, his expression unreadable but kind. Their eyes met, and for a moment, she thought she saw the slightest hint of acknowledgement, a recognition of a shared moment that neither of them would forget. The fasten seatbelt sign clicked off, and passengers rose to gather their belongings. Meredith reached out and touched Jake's arm, feeling the steady beat of his pulse under her fingertips. Life, fragile and resilient, continued. As Marcus stood to retrieve his briefcase, he paused, looking at Meredith with a hint of a smile. "Take care," he said, his voice low but resonant. Meredith's breath caught, and she nodded. Thank you, truly. The simple exchange, made in the briefest of moments, carried the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Meredith felt the thrum of its engines pulse beneath her feet. The cabin lights brightened, casting a warm glow that banished the night's tension. Passengers were shifting, collecting their belongings and making small talk, but Meredith sat still, her mind replaying the last few hours. Jake, now wide awake, peered out the window, the morning sun casting a halo around his face. Marcus stood a few rows ahead, waiting his turn to collect his briefcase from the overhead bin. His expression remained composed, yet his presence now held a new significance for Meredith. The reality of what he had done for Jake was settling deeper into her, shaking loose old assumptions and exposing raw truths. A small, timid voice brought her back. "Mom, did I really stop breathing?" Jake asked, his eyes wide with leftover fear. "You did," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "But you're okay now, thanks to Judge Hayes." Jake's gaze followed hers across the aisle. Marcus caught their glance and nodded, a quiet, reassuring gesture. The simplicity of that moment was stark against the weight it carried. The cabin doors opened with a mechanical whir, and passengers shuffled into the narrow aisle, retrieving their bags and coats. The energy was a blend of post-flight relief and anticipation for the day ahead. Meredith stood, her legs unsteady, and reached for her bag. Marcus moved smoothly into the aisle, waiting for the line of passengers to clear. He seemed to be a pillar of calm, even as others brushed past him in a hurry. Before she knew what she was doing, Meredith found herself next to him, the words caught in her throat. "Judge Hayes," she started, her voice softer than she intended. Marcus turned to her, his eyes meeting hers without a trace of judgment, only patience. "I wanted to thank you again," she continued, her voice steadier now. "I owe you more than I can say." He regarded her for a moment before responding. "You don't owe me anything. Just take care of him." His gaze flicked briefly to Jake before he stepped forward, blending into the stream of passengers heading down the jet bridge. Meredith's heart twisted. The simple kindness in his response held up a mirror to her. It was as if he saw more than she was prepared to share. The terminal was a stark contrast to the hush of the plane, a cacophony of voices, announcements, and rolling suitcases. Jake tugged on her sleeve, urging her to move toward the exit. Meredith followed, glancing once more to where Marcus was speaking with another passenger, his head nodding thoughtfully as he listened. "Mom, can we talk to him one more time?" Jake asked, the hope in his voice palpable. Meredith hesitated, then shook her head gently. "He's busy, Jake. We'll thank him properly another time. But what if we don't see him again?" Jake's brows furrowed with the earnestness of a child who saw things more simply, more clearly. "We'll see," Meredith said, knowing that the words rang hollow even as she said them. Hours later, as they sat in their living room, the city's noises filtering through the open window, Meredith still felt the plane's tension echoing in her mind. Jake, now relaxed and recounting the story to his father over the phone, spoke with an enthusiasm that belied the fear he'd faced. "Yeah, Dad, he was a judge. He helped me breathe when I couldn't. It was really cool," Jake said, his voice cracking with excitement. Meredith sat back, letting the details wash over her. The day's events were no longer just moments. They were shifting her perspective piece by piece. The thought of her initial discomfort with Marcus now felt almost unbearable, a stain on an otherwise transformative day. The next morning, Meredith sipped her coffee, the warmth seeping into her hands as she flipped through her phone. A headline caught her eye. "Passenger's Heroic Act. Judge Intervenes to Save Boy on Flight." The article recounted the incident with clear, factual language, describing Marcus as a judge known for his commitment to fairness and justice. She scrolled through the comments, most of which were full of praise. "This is the kind of news we need more of," one comment read. Another added, "A reminder that not all heroes wear capes." Meredith's heart twisted again, this time with a mix of guilt and something lighter, more hopeful. The world's acknowledgement of Marcus's act felt right, but it also reminded her of how wrong she'd been, how quickly she'd judged before truly seeing him. Later that day, Meredith called a close friend, Lisa, someone who shared her social circle but whose views often leaned more progressive. They hadn't spoken since before the flight, and Meredith felt a pull to share her experience. "Lisa, you wouldn't believe what happened on the plane yesterday," she started, recounting Jake's crisis and Marcus's intervention. She left out her initial reaction to him, unsure how to voice it yet. "Wow, that's incredible," Lisa said, her tone warm. "It really makes you think, doesn't it? We hear so much about the bad, but there are people out there doing good every day." Meredith's silence was telling. The weight of her realization hung between them, unspoken, but understood. In the days that followed, Meredith found herself revisiting the moment on the plane. The calm in Marcus's voice as he helped Jake. The way he returned to his seat as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She sought out more articles about him, discovering a man who had faced obstacles yet used his position to advocate for fairness. She attended a book club meeting later that week, one where conversations often turned to safe topics. Children's achievements, vacation plans, local gossip. That evening, when someone brought up the latest news story, a celebrity's public misstep, Meredith spoke up without thinking. "Have you heard about the judge who helped a boy on a flight?" she asked, her voice cutting through the chatter. The women around her paused, some tilting their heads in interest, others with slight frowns. "I saw that," one woman said slowly. "That was something, wasn't it?" Meredith nodded, her pulse quickening. "It was my son," she said, feeling the weight of the admission, both grounding and freeing. The room filled with murmurs, eyes turning toward her with questions and a new kind of attention. The conversation shifted to broader topics, about compassion, about how little gestures sometimes revealed the truest parts of people. For the first time, Meredith found herself truly listening, not just preparing her own contributions or dismissing ideas that challenged her comfort. Driving home that night, she felt different, as though Marcus's actions had not only saved Jake, but had also cracked open a part of her that had remained closed for far too long. The lessons she thought she'd learned were now evolving, reaching into spaces she hadn't known needed change. The flight, a singular event, had become more than a scare or an anecdote. It was a turning point that made her question not just that moment, but all the moments before it, and the ones yet to come. The days following the flight felt different for Meredith, marked by a sense of disquiet and reflection that she couldn't easily dismiss. The sun rose and set over the Manhattan skyline as usual, but each day carried the imprint of Marcus Hayes's calm intervention and her own mixed emotions. Jake's enthusiasm didn't wane. He told the story repeatedly, from the dinner table to phone calls with his cousins, describing how a real-life hero had saved him. His unbridled admiration painted Marcus as larger than life, and each retelling made Meredith's chest tighten. Not with fear, but with something closer to shame. She wished she could tell Jake the whole story, her hesitations and assumptions, but he was too young to understand the complexities of what she was grappling with. At night, as the city's lights twinkled outside her window, Meredith lay awake, turning over moments in her mind. The casual biases she'd absorbed, the warnings from friends that felt so innocuous at the time, came back with sharper edges. The way she had instinctively wanted Marcus to be moved, a man who had done nothing but sit quietly, was a thought that now churned in her stomach. The next weekend, Meredith found herself flipping through an old photo album she kept in the living room. Pictures of family trips, Jake's first steps, and dinner parties with friends stared back at her. In one photo, she stood at a club gala, surrounded by familiar faces. It was an event she remembered vividly, laughter and whispered comments shared behind polite smiles. A phrase surfaced from that evening, something a friend had said with a conspiratorial chuckle. "Well, we know who really belongs here." The memory made her skin prickle. It hadn't meant anything then, not enough for her to challenge it. But now, in the aftermath of the flight, those comments seemed hollow, tainted by the realization that her silence had been complicity. Meredith closed the album with a snap, feeling a mix of anger and determination. The flight hadn't just been an isolated moment, it was a catalyst for seeing the truths she'd ignored. Lisa, her progressive friend, invited Meredith for coffee. The cafe was crowded and filled with the warm scent of cinnamon and espresso. Meredith felt nervous, knowing that Lisa was perceptive enough to pick up on her recent shift in demeanor. "So, how have things been?" Lisa asked, sipping her latte. Her tone was casual, but her eyes were searching. Meredith took a breath. "I told you about Jake's allergic reaction on the flight, but I didn't tell you everything." She recounted the story in more detail this time, not just Marcus's intervention, but her own initial unease and the uncomfortable truths that had surfaced since. Lisa nodded slowly. "You know, recognizing it is the hardest part for most people," she said. "It's easier to stay in the bubble." Meredith's fingers toyed with her coffee cup. "I didn't realize how tightly I held onto that bubble until it burst," she admitted. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe washing over them. Lisa reached across the table and squeezed Meredith's hand. "It's not where you start that matters, it's where you go from here." The words hung between them, offering both reassurance and a challenge. Back at home, Meredith scrolled through articles on her laptop about implicit bias and stories of people confronting their ingrained beliefs. She read personal accounts from those who had questioned their perspectives and sought to change. The process neither simple nor immediate. One article featured a quote that stuck with her. "Growth starts when we recognize that we've been standing still." The words resonated deeply, summing up what she'd been struggling to put into perspective. Jake bounded into the room, homework in hand. "Mom, can we work on my history project together?" he asked. "Of course," she said, setting aside her laptop. The project was on American civil rights leaders, a topic that now seemed to carry even more weight than before. As Jake worked on his report, they discussed figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Thurgood Marshall. The project was meant to be simple, but Meredith found herself contributing more than facts. She talked to Jake about what those leaders stood for, their belief in justice, and how their actions created ripples that changed society. "Kinda like what Judge Hayes did for us, right?" Jake said, looking up from his notes. The innocent comparison made Meredith pause, her throat tightening. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice softer. "Exactly like that." The next day, Meredith took a step she never would have considered before. She emailed the community center Lisa had mentioned, asking to attend one of their workshops on understanding racial bias and privilege. She felt a twist of anxiety as she hit send, but it was followed by a sense of purpose. The center's reply came quickly, inviting her to join a session at the end of the week. The email outlined what to expect: open discussions, listening exercises, and the sharing of personal stories. The thought was daunting, but the idea of staying the same was even more unsettling. The day of the workshop arrived, and Meredith found herself walking into a bright, airy room filled with folding chairs arranged in a circle. She recognized no one, and the unfamiliarity tightened the knot in her chest. A facilitator, a woman named Angela with kind eyes and a welcoming smile, introduced herself and invited the attendees to share why they were there. When it was Meredith's turn, she spoke slowly, measuring each word. "I had an experience that made me realize I have assumptions, biases, that I wasn't aware of," she said, looking at her hands. "I'm here to understand them and do better." Angela nodded. "Awareness is the first step. The hard work comes next, and that's why we're here." As the session continued, stories emerged from the circle. Stories of personal revelations, moments of realization, and the discomfort of confronting oneself. Meredith listened intently, finding echoes of her own story in others' words. The journey was not unique to her. It was shared by many who decided to face it head-on. By the end of the session, she felt a sense of kinship with the people in the room. They were all here for the same reason: to see what they hadn't allowed themselves to see before. Walking out into the cool evening air, Meredith felt lighter. The first step was always the hardest, but now, each one after felt possible. The week after Meredith's first workshop at the community center, the routine of her life seemed to resume as usual. She attended board meetings for her part-time work, joined her friends at their weekly lunch gatherings, and helped Jake with his school assignments. But under the surface, something had shifted irrevocably. Her conversations with friends, once filled with light gossip and plans for fundraisers, now felt hollow unless she addressed what had begun to bubble within her. At lunch one afternoon, Meredith sat among her closest friends in a trendy cafe. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversation surrounded them. Sarah, one of her longest acquaintances, was talking animatedly about an upcoming charity gala when the topic veered unexpectedly. "Did you hear about that judge in the news? The one who helped that boy on the plane?" Sarah said, glancing at Meredith. "Apparently, he's quite famous in legal circles." Meredith tensed, a small, sharp pang in her chest. She took a sip of water, the coolness doing little to steady her racing heart. "Yes, I did," she said finally. "It was my son, Jake, that he helped." The table fell silent, each face registering surprise, curiosity, or slight discomfort. Meredith's admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. "Wait, you're Jake?" another friend, Caroline, asked, leaning forward. "What happened?" Meredith told the story, starting with Jake's sudden allergic reaction and ending with Marcus Hayes's calm intervention. She spoke with careful honesty, omitting none of the crucial details, including her initial hesitation when Marcus boarded the plane. When she finished, there was a pause before Sarah spoke again. "It's incredible, really. You never know who you're sitting next to," she said, her tone thoughtful, but laced with an edge that made Meredith's pulse quicken. "You don't," Meredith agreed, but this time her voice was stronger. "And it makes you think about how often we let those assumptions shape the way we see people before we know them." The conversation shifted uncomfortably, some of the women nodding while others looked away, pretending interest in their salads or checking their phones. The silence that followed felt different from any they'd shared before. Charged, almost daring someone to challenge what Meredith had said. Later that day, Meredith returned home, the subtle tension from lunch clinging to her like a shadow. She sank into the couch, running a hand through her hair as she replayed the conversation. It was the first time she had voiced aloud what had been circling in her thoughts since the flight, and it felt both liberating and terrifying. Jake's voice called out from the hallway, pulling her back to the present. "Mom, can you help me with my project?" She walked into his room, where posters of superheroes and maps of the world lined the walls. Jake sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by books and notes. "What part do you need help with?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "Can you read this part?" "I wrote about how Thurgood Marshall worked to make things fair for everyone," Jake said, handing her a notebook. Meredith's eyes scanned the paragraph, pride swelling in her chest. "It's very good, Jake. You know, fairness and justice aren't just things that happen in history. There are people working on those same things today." "Like Judge Hayes?" Jake asked, his eyes bright. "Exactly like him," she said, her voice soft but certain. The words carried more weight than Jake could know, but saying them out loud made them feel truer than ever. A few days later, Meredith attended a panel discussion at the local library. The topic was Understanding Implicit Bias in Modern Society. And while it was not her typical event, she felt drawn to it. The room was filled with an eclectic mix of people. Students, community leaders, retirees, all there for the same reason: to learn. As the panelists introduced themselves, Meredith's breath caught in her throat. Among them was Marcus Hayes. He wore a dark suit, and his demeanor was as composed and approachable as she remembered. He spoke with measured confidence about his experiences on and off the bench, emphasizing the importance of empathy in both personal and professional life. "Implicit bias is not always overt," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the room. "Sometimes it's in the quick judgments we make, or the silence we keep when faced with situations that challenge us. But acknowledging it is the first step toward meaningful change." Meredith's cheeks warmed, his words landing close to home. When the panel ended, people clustered around Marcus to shake his hand and ask questions. Meredith hesitated at the edge of the room, unsure if approaching him was the right move. Finally, as the crowd thinned, Marcus glanced up and noticed her. A hint of recognition crossed his face, and he offered a small smile. She stepped forward, nerves jangling. "Judge Hayes," she began, her voice steady but low. I didn't expect to see you here. It's good to see you again, Mrs. Calloway, he said, the corners of his mouth lifting. How's Jake? He's doing well, thanks to you, she said, the gratitude in her voice unmistakable. I came to this talk because of everything that happened on that flight. It made me realize there's more I need to understand. Marcus nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. The first step is always the hardest, but it's also the most important one. They stood in silence for a moment, the bustling noise of the room fading as the unspoken understanding between them solidified. It wasn't a grand reconciliation or an epiphany that changed everything at once, but it was a start. Meredith left the library feeling lighter. The encounter with Marcus had affirmed that she was on the right path, even if it was still unfamiliar and full of uncertainty. She decided to share her experience at her next community center workshop, breaking her silence and opening herself up to vulnerability. The following week, she spoke in front of the group, recounting her journey from the flight to that day. I realized that biases aren't just things other people have, she said, her voice cracking slightly. They're things we all carry, whether we admit it or not. Angela, the facilitator, nodded. And the work to confront them is ongoing. Thank you for sharing, Meredith. The group's response was warm, supportive. Some members shared their own stories, creating a web of connection that felt genuine and shared. Meredith's transformation began to seep into her conversations at home. During dinner one night, Jake mentioned his school project again. "Mom, can I invite Judge Hayes to come speak to my class?" he asked, eyes wide with excitement. Meredith's fork paused midair. The idea was both daunting and exhilarating. "I don't know if he'd have the time, but we can certainly ask," she said, the idea sparking something hopeful in her. Later, she emailed Marcus, thanking him again and mentioning Jake's project. To her surprise, his reply came the next day. "I'd be happy to consider it. Let me know when and where." When Marcus visited Jake's class a few weeks later, Meredith watched from the back of the room. He spoke to the students with the same calm authority he'd shown on the flight, weaving stories of justice and fairness into lessons the children could understand. As he wrapped up, Marcus glanced at Meredith, a subtle nod passing between them that spoke volumes. The moment felt like a full circle, an acknowledgement of growth, change, and shared humanity. When Jake ran to her after the talk, his eyes shining, Meredith felt the warmth of hope bloom in her chest. It wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a chapter she was proud to be writing. The day after Marcus spoke to Jake's class, Meredith sat at her kitchen table, watching the early morning light filter through the window. The conversation in the classroom had replayed in her mind all night. Marcus had talked to the children about fairness, in a way that was simple but powerful, sharing examples that highlighted empathy over legal jargon. Jake's eyes had lit up with every story, and his questions had shown a maturity Meredith hadn't seen before. The shift in her son mirrored her own, but it also pushed Meredith to confront how far she still had to go. The journey she'd started at the community center was only scratching the surface, and the lunch with her friends had shown her that change was not always met with open arms. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from Lisa. "Want to join me for a volunteer event this weekend? It's at the community center. Should be right up your alley now." Meredith smiled and texted back a quick, "Yes, count me in." As Saturday approached, Meredith mentioned the volunteer event to her husband, Tom. He was a stockbroker with a commanding presence and a pragmatic approach to life. They'd been married for nearly 2 decades, their routines intertwined like the city streets they called home. "Lisa invited me to volunteer at the community center this weekend," she said over dinner, trying to keep her tone casual. Tom looked up from his plate, eyebrows raised. "Community center? What for?" "It's part of the outreach program they do, workshops and support for people trying to navigate social challenges," she said, hoping to keep the explanation simple. Tom's brows knitted. "Since when did you get involved in that kind of thing?" Meredith's smile faltered, and she put down her fork. "Since recently. It's important to me, Tom. I think it's important to our family." He shrugged, the conversation seeming to end there. But a ripple of tension settled over the table, unspoken, but felt. The community center buzzed with energy when Meredith arrived. Tables were set up with crafts, educational pamphlets, and sign-up sheets for various programs. Lisa waved from across the room, a grin on her face. "Glad you came," she called out as Meredith made her way over. They spent the morning setting up activities for families, explaining resources, and mingling with volunteers. The diverse group was warm and welcoming, filled with laughter and stories shared over cups of coffee. Meredith felt a sense of purpose that was new and invigorating. During a break, Angela, the facilitator from her workshop, approached. "Good to see you here, Meredith," she said, handing her a cup of tea. "You're a natural at this." "I'm trying," Meredith replied, a sincere smile breaking through. "It's one thing to learn about change, but it feels different to be part of it." Angela nodded, her expression one of approval. "It's not always easy. There are days when it feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But you keep going." Near the end of the event, Meredith heard a familiar deep voice at the entrance. She turned and saw Marcus Hayes speaking with one of the event coordinators. He was dressed in casual slacks and a button-down shirt, but he still carried the same composed aura. Their eyes met, and Marcus approached, a friendly smile on his face. "Good to see you again, Mrs. Calloway. Volunteering today?" he asked. "Yes," she said, the warmth in her voice evident. "I'm trying to get more involved." Marcus nodded, a look of approval crossing his face. "We need more people who are willing to step out of their comfort zones." They talked briefly, sharing stories of the event and its impact. As he moved on to speak with other volunteers, Meredith felt the now familiar mixture of awe and gratitude. Each conversation with Marcus seemed to push her further along this path she was starting to carve out for herself. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Tom glanced at Meredith over the edge of his newspaper. "So, how was your community event?" he asked, the question casual, but with an undercurrent she couldn't quite read. "It was good. Eye-opening, really," Meredith said, searching his face for a reaction. "Marcus Hayes was there. He's deeply involved in these programs." Tom set down the paper, his gaze more direct. "Is this going to become a regular thing for you?" "I hope so," she said. "It's changing how I see things, how I understand people. I think it's something we could all benefit from." Tom sighed, not out of anger but resignation. "Just don't lose yourself in it, Meredith. We have our own life, our own responsibilities." The comment stung more than she'd expected. "Maybe seeing beyond ourselves is what we've needed all along," she replied, softer than she intended. A few days later, Lisa called with an invitation to join a smaller focused group discussion at her house. "It's just a few people I know who are trying to navigate the same questions you've been asking," she said. "You'll fit right in." The gathering was intimate, just a handful of people seated in Lisa's cozy living room. The conversation was open, raw at times, filled with shared stories of re-examined beliefs and the challenges that came with them. Meredith felt comforted by the honesty, realizing she wasn't alone in this. One man, Carlos, shared a story about confronting a colleague over a discriminatory comment. "It wasn't easy, and it didn't go well, but I couldn't stay silent anymore," he said, looking around the room for understanding. Meredith nodded. "I know what you mean. Silence feels safer, but it keeps us stuck." Lisa leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Exactly. We can't change everything overnight, but conversations like this are how we start." Not long after the discussion at Lisa's, Meredith attended another book club meeting. This time she felt more prepared, more willing to speak up if the conversation shifted toward the comfortable biases she'd once allowed to go unchecked. The group gathered around the table, glasses of wine in hand, as someone brought up a recent news story. The comments that followed were tinged with assumptions that now grated against Meredith's evolving perspective. "Sometimes people bring things on themselves," Caroline said, echoing an opinion that had once seemed unremarkable to Meredith. Meredith set her glass down, the sound sharper than she intended. "Do they?" she said, her voice measured. "Or do we just not understand their stories well enough to know what they face?" The room quieted, eyes shifting toward her. A few uncomfortable smiles flickered, and someone quickly changed the topic, but the silence spoke volumes. It was the first time Meredith had challenged the status quo, and though it left a strange energy in the air, she felt a surge of quiet pride. As Meredith drove home that night, she replayed the moment over and over. It wasn't a grand statement or an act of defiance, but it was a step. She'd spoken up, and while it hadn't been met with applause or easy understanding, it felt right. When she got home, Jake was still up, sprawled on the couch with a comic book. He looked up as she walked in. "Hey, Mom, did you change the world tonight?" he asked with a grin. She laughed, ruffling his hair as she sat beside him. "Not quite," she said, the smile lingering, "but I think I'm starting to." The long descent she'd been navigating wasn't just about admitting past mistakes. It was about learning how to walk a new path. And while each step carried its share of weight, it also carried the promise of something better. Word of Meredith's growing involvement in community initiatives and her newfound voice in challenging conversations began to spread quietly among her circle. Some friends reached out with supportive comments, curious about her shift, while others kept their distance, their silence speaking volumes. One morning, while checking her emails, Meredith received a message from Alyssa Peterson, the flight attendant from the pivotal flight. It read, "I heard you've been more involved in community work and sharing your story. Just wanted to say that what you're doing matters more than you know. Best, Alyssa." The unexpected encouragement warmed Meredith. It was a reminder that actions, even those that felt small or uncomfortable, had wider ripples. She replied, expressing her gratitude and promising to stay in touch. At school, Jake's enthusiasm for learning about historical figures and modern-day leaders continued to grow. His teacher, Miss Reynolds, noticed the change and called Meredith to commend him. "He's been talking a lot about justice and fairness lately. He even shared about the judge who helped him on the flight," she said over the phone, a note of curiosity in her voice. Meredith smiled, pride swelling. "Yes, that experience really impacted him and me." "Well, it shows," Ms. Reynolds said warmly. "We're actually thinking of inviting a few guest speakers to discuss careers in law and public service. I thought maybe you'd want to be involved." The idea of stepping further into a public role both excited and terrified Meredith. But the more she thought about it, the more she knew that sharing her journey was part of the change she wanted to see. A week later, Meredith found herself standing in the school auditorium, speaking to a group of students about the importance of empathy and confronting one's biases. Marcus Hayes had agreed to participate as a guest speaker, and he stood next to her, a symbol of the journey that had brought her here. The students listened attentively as Marcus recounted stories from his time on the bench, focusing on cases that highlighted both the difficulties and the importance of understanding different perspectives. His voice was steady, his words resonant. When it was Meredith's turn, she hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "We all have moments where we think we know what's right, only to realize we've been seeing the world through a narrow lens. The day Judge Hayes helped my son was the day my lens began to change, and I'm still learning how to keep it open." Jake, sitting in the front row, beamed with pride, his gaze never leaving her face. The event at the school garnered attention, not just from the students, but from parents and teachers who heard about it afterward. Meredith received emails and messages, some filled with gratitude, others with questions that challenged her to explain her shift further. One email stood out. It was from a parent named Melanie, who confessed that she'd struggled with similar feelings and assumptions, but had never found a way to confront them. "Your story gave me the push I needed," it read. "Thank you for showing that it's never too late to change." Meredith's eyes stung as she read the message. She realized that while her journey had been personal, it was also universal. The act of confronting one's biases was not a solitary battle, but part of a larger movement toward empathy and fairness. Tom's reactions to Meredith's new commitments remained mixed. He watched her involvement from a distance, supportive but reserved. One evening, after she'd spent the day at a community center meeting, he finally broached the subject. "You're spending a lot of time on this," he said, not accusingly, but with a note of concern. "I just don't want you to get caught up in something that takes too much away from us." Meredith set down her bag, meeting his eyes. "I know it seems sudden, but it's not. I need to do this, Tom. For Jake, for myself, and for what it could mean for us as a family." We can't live with our eyes half closed anymore. Tom nodded slowly, his expression softening. I get it, I think. Just promise me you'll find a balance. I will, she said, and for the first time she felt that she could. One evening, Marcus called Meredith, suggesting they meet for coffee to discuss future speaking engagements and how they could collaborate to reach more communities. They met at a small, quiet cafe, where the scent of roasted beans mingled with the low murmur of conversation. I wanted to thank you for inviting me to Jake's school, Marcus said, taking a sip of his drink. It's important work, and it's clear that you're making a difference. Meredith smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and humility. I should be the one thanking you. None of this would have happened if you hadn't stepped in that day. Marcus leaned back, eyes thoughtful. Moments like those aren't about heroism. They're about doing what needs to be done. And now, you're doing what needs to be done too. Their conversation shifted to plans for future workshops and panels, both agreeing that continuing to share real stories was the way to spark deeper understanding. The connection felt more than professional. It was rooted in a shared belief that empathy could be taught and spread. As months passed, Meredith became a familiar face at community events. She spoke at panels, contributed to discussions, and continued attending workshops. Her presence inspired others, encouraging them to engage in conversations that might have once felt uncomfortable. At one event, a young woman approached her. I heard your story at the community center last month, she said. I just wanted to say that it helped me talk to my parents about things I didn't think I could before. Meredith's chest filled with warmth. Thank you for telling me. That means more than you know. The ripples of Marcus's initial act of kindness had reached far beyond that single flight, touching not only Meredith's life, but countless others. At home, change was becoming more tangible. Jake spoke about fairness with the clarity of a child who was learning how to look beyond himself. Even Tom, whose initial reservations had made Meredith cautious, began to show subtle signs of understanding. One night, he mentioned that his office was starting a diversity and inclusion initiative, and that he'd volunteered to be part of it. I figured it was time, he said, his voice soft but resolute. Meredith's heart swelled. I'm proud of you, she said. The words weighted with genuine affection. As they sat together, the quiet of the house felt different. More connected, more alive with the potential for change. Meredith stood at her window, the late spring sun casting soft light across the room. The city outside hummed with life, but her thoughts were on the journey that had brought her here. It had been months since the flight, and the subtle, continuous work of changing herself and her environment had become part of her daily life. The steps she and Marcus had taken together to organize talks and community panels were making a difference, but there was still so much more to do. Emails and messages filled her inbox, many from parents who had attended her talks or heard about the community events. Each one was a reminder that sharing her story wasn't just about her growth. It was about inspiring others to start their own journeys. One message stood out that morning from Melanie, the parent who had reached out after hearing her speak at Jake's school. I'd like to help with your next event. I've been trying to find my voice too, and I think this is a way I can start. Meredith's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a smile spreading across her face as she replied, You're more than welcome. Let's talk soon. Meredith met Marcus and Lisa at the community center to discuss their next event, a panel featuring local leaders, educators, and Marcus himself. The room was buzzing with volunteers, setting up chairs, arranging tables, and putting out flyers. Looks like the turnout will be strong, Marcus said, surveying the setup. His calm demeanor carried an undercurrent of pride. Word is getting out, Lisa said, giving Meredith a nudge. People are listening because they see you're sincere, Meredith. Meredith felt a twinge of nervousness. She knew that vulnerability was necessary for growth, but each new step brought its own fears. Would her story resonate again? Would people see it as genuine or just another social experiment? Marcus seemed to read her hesitation. Authenticity matters, he said quietly. And people can tell when it's real. You're showing them that change isn't just possible, it's necessary. The weight of his words grounded her. This was about more than just a single speech or panel. It was about the long-term impact on how people thought and interacted with one another. The day of the event arrived, and the room filled quickly. Parents, teachers, students, and community members of all backgrounds packed into the space, their conversations blending into an excited hum. Jake sat in the front row, waving at Meredith as she took her place on stage next to Marcus and the other panelists. Marcus began with a story from his early days as a public defender, illustrating the importance of seeing people beyond their labels and understanding the complexities of their lives. His voice carried authority, but was infused with empathy, drawing nods and thoughtful expressions from the crowd. When it was Meredith's turn, she took a deep breath. "I used to believe that good intentions were enough," she started, scanning the faces in the room. "But I learned that silence is its own kind of decision, one that lets assumptions and biases grow unchecked. I saw this firsthand, and it changed me." She recounted the flight and the days that followed, how Marcus's act of kindness had been the catalyst for her transformation. "It isn't just about big moments," she said. "It's about the small choices we make every day to see people for who they really are." Applause rippled through the room, and as Meredith stepped back, she caught Marcus's eye. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement that they were on the right path. After the event, attendees stayed to talk, forming small groups that buzzed with discussion. Meredith moved among them, listening and engaging. One conversation caught her attention. A young woman named Tara was speaking animatedly with a teacher about the importance of empathy in education. "You're right," the teacher said, nodding. "We need to make it part of the curriculum, not just a lesson here and there." Meredith approached them. "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know," she said, and the offer felt both natural and significant. This was the kind of ripple effect Marcus had spoken about. Tara smiled, her eyes bright. "Actually, would you be willing to speak at our school? It would make a huge impact." Meredith felt a surge of excitement. "Absolutely." That night, back at home, Meredith sat down with Tom and Jake. The house was quieter, a contrast to the energy of the event, but the silence felt full, not empty. Tom had attended the panel, slipping in after work and watching from the back. It was the first time he'd seen her speak publicly, and she was curious about what he thought. "You were amazing, Mom," Jake said, his voice full of admiration. Tom nodded, a small smile breaking through. I didn't realize how far you'd come with all of this until I saw it firsthand." Meredith reached for Tom's hand, a gesture that was both grounding and connective. "It's not just me, you know. We're all part of this. I want Jake to grow up knowing that being brave means more than just standing up for himself. It means standing up for others, too." Tom's eyes softened. "I think he's starting to see that. I think we both are." As the weeks went on, Meredith's involvement deepened. She co-led workshops at the community center and collaborated with schools to create programs that taught empathy, understanding, and the importance of questioning assumptions. Marcus continued to join her when he could, their shared vision evolving from a chance encounter into a true partnership. At one session, Marcus spoke about the power of everyday heroes, the people who stepped up when it mattered, not for recognition, but because it was right. "We can all be that person," he said, "and when we are, we change more than just a moment. We change the way people see the world." Meredith watched as heads nodded, and she felt a familiar warmth. It wasn't just the message that resonated, it was the hope that people were ready to act on it. Meredith's social circle shifted in subtle but noticeable ways. Some friends embraced her journey, joining her at events and engaging in deeper conversations. Others distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the changes they saw in her. Caroline, who had once been quick with dismissive comments, now listened more than she spoke, her eyes reflecting thought rather than judgment. One afternoon, over coffee, Caroline admitted, "I've been thinking about what you said at book club. I didn't want to hear it then, but I can't stop thinking about it now." Meredith smiled gently. "It's not easy to start, but it's worth it. And we're all learning as we go." The conversation felt like a small victory, one that reaffirmed that even the most entrenched perspectives could shift. The community center held a celebration for their volunteers and participants, a way to acknowledge the progress made and inspire continued growth. The room was filled with familiar faces: Angela, Lisa, Marcus, and others who had become part of this shared mission. As they mingled, Marcus leaned toward Meredith and said, "Look around. This is what change looks like. Small, steady, and growing." She did, taking in the laughter, the conversations, and the mix of people from different walks of life. The journey that had started with a single, frightening moment on a flight had evolved into something so much more. A community committed to understanding and compassion. For the first time, Meredith felt not only proud, but hopeful. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The summer air was warm and heavy as Meredith arrived at the community center for another event. This time, a workshop designed to foster open dialogues between different generations. The event was called Bridging Perspectives, a collaboration between the community center and local schools. Families, teenagers, and seniors gathered, their conversations a blend of cautious introductions and lively exchanges. Meredith took her place at a round table next to Marcus, who was reviewing his notes. He looked up, giving her a reassuring smile. "Ready for another day of shifting the status quo?" he teased lightly. She laughed, a sound that came more easily now. "Ready as I'll ever be." The day began with guided discussions. Each group shared personal stories about times when they had felt misunderstood or had misunderstood someone else. Meredith listened as a teenage girl spoke about being judged for her accent, and a senior citizen recounted moment of feeling dismissed because of his age. The conversations were raw, sometimes uncomfortable, but always honest. When it was Meredith's turn, she told the story of that fateful flight and the moments of awakening that followed. "We all carry things we aren't always aware of. Assumptions, biases, fears," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "But the real work starts when we acknowledge them and decide to do something about it." The workshop was deemed a success, and as people filtered out of the room, Meredith caught snippets of conversation that left her hopeful. An older woman was talking to a young man about how the workshop had changed her perception of his generation. A mother and daughter were discussing how they could communicate better at home. As Marcus packed up his materials, he turned to Meredith. "You know, this is only the beginning," he said, a hint of challenge in his voice. "There's so much more to be done." "I know," Meredith replied, "and I'm ready for it." Their conversation shifted to upcoming events and new ways to involve more people. They discussed collaborating on a series of talks at local schools and expanding outreach to neighboring communities. "You've come a long way, Meredith," Marcus said as they walked to their cars. "But don't underestimate the impact of where you started." She nodded, understanding that every step forward was built on the moment she had looked beyond her assumptions and seen him for who he was, a person who had chosen compassion when it mattered most. A few months later, Meredith and Marcus were invited to participate in a televised panel discussion about building empathy and addressing unconscious bias. The invitation was unexpected, but Marcus encouraged her to join. "Your story resonates because it's real," he said. "People need to hear it." The studio was buzzing with activity when they arrived. Bright lights and bustling crew members created a frenetic energy that made Meredith's heart race. She glanced at Marcus, who appeared calm and unfazed. The panel included educators, activists, and community leaders from around the country. When it was Meredith's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and looked out at the cameras and the audience beyond them. "Change isn't about one big moment," she said. "It's about hundreds of small ones, each one a choice to see more clearly, to listen more openly, and to act with more compassion." Marcus followed her remarks with a story of a courtroom case that had taught him the importance of empathy, not just as a personal value, but as a social necessity. The combination of their stories wove a narrative that spoke to the power of shared experiences and the importance of stepping outside one's comfort zone. The panel was well received, sparking conversations online and in community forums. People reached out to Meredith, some sharing their own stories of recognition and change, while others asked for advice on where to start. One message from a young mother stood out. I never thought much about how my own beliefs were shaping my children until I heard your story. Thank you for inspiring me to start looking at things differently." Meredith felt a swell of hope. The change was no longer just in her life or her immediate circle. It was spreading further than she had ever imagined. Meredith's newfound prominence in community work led to an invitation to join the advisory board of the community center. It was a role she hadn't expected, but accepted with pride. Her responsibilities now included planning larger events, securing funding, and finding ways to reach more people. Marcus continued as a partner and mentor, his insights invaluable as they worked together to expand their efforts. One day, while reviewing the plans for a new youth mentorship program, Meredith looked up at Marcus. "Did you ever think that one flight would lead to all this?" she asked, half smiling. He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, but I'm not surprised. Change has a way of starting in the most unexpected places." The community center organized an appreciation evening for its volunteers and leaders, a chance to celebrate their progress and look ahead. The hall was decorated with photos from past events, quotes from participants, and artwork by local students inspired by the workshops. Tom and Jake joined Meredith at the event, their presence a symbol of how far their family had come. Tom, once skeptical, now volunteered regularly with diversity initiatives at his firm. Jake, who had grown in both age and understanding, helped organize the event, beaming as he showed his friends around. During the evening, Marcus took the stage to say a few words. "This journey is about seeing each other, truly seeing each other, and knowing that when we do, we find more similarities than differences," he said, his voice strong and clear. When it was Meredith's turn, she felt a familiar blend of nerves and gratitude. "A year ago, I would never have imagined standing here," she began. "But what I've learned is that change starts with a moment that grows, reaches out, and connects us all." As applause filled the room, Meredith looked out at the faces in the crowd. Friends, neighbors, volunteers, and her own family. The journey had been one of hard truths and hopeful realizations, but it was one she would not trade for anything. The work continued beyond that night. Meredith's story was featured in a local magazine, highlighting her journey from that pivotal flight to her role in the community. It wasn't a story of perfection, but one of progress and determination, a narrative that resonated with readers who saw pieces of themselves in her journey. In the following weeks, Meredith noticed changes even in her casual interactions. Conversations with friends were more open, filled with curiosity instead of judgment. Invitations to speak at events and schools became more frequent, each one an opportunity to encourage others to take that first step. Jake, now older and even more inspired, decided to create a project for his school's community service initiative. He called it the Ripple Effect, a campaign to encourage students to identify moments in their lives where they could make a positive change. However small, Marcus visited the school to speak again, further igniting the students' passion for community involvement. When the project won an award for its impact, Jake stood on stage, holding his certificate with a proud smile. He looked at Meredith in the audience, and for a moment she saw the echoes of their shared journey reflected in his eyes. Not everything was seamless. Meredith still encountered resistance, especially from those who weren't ready to question their own beliefs. Some meetings were tense, with defensive comments or dismissive attitudes. But now, those moments only strengthened her resolve. She leaned on the support system she'd built, knowing that the road to change was never without obstacles. Marcus reminded her during one such difficult moment, "Every step, even the hard ones, is part of building a better path." One evening, Meredith sat on her porch, the city skyline twinkling in the distance. The air was warm, filled with the distant sounds of life moving on. Tom joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "We've come a long way," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "We have," she replied, the weight of the past year settling in her chest, not as a burden, but as proof of how far they'd come. "It's good to see you so happy," Tom added, his voice sincere. Meredith smiled, looking out at the horizon. "It's not just happiness, Tom. It's hopes." The community center's youth mentorship program was in full swing, and Meredith helped lead a session with Marcus. Kids of all backgrounds filled the room, sharing ideas and learning from one another. Jake assisted, guiding younger students with enthusiasm. Marcus leaned over and whispered to Meredith, "Look at that! Proof that the seeds we plant do grow." She nodded, eyes misting as she watched Jake lead a discussion. This was the legacy she had hoped for, one that would continue beyond her and Marcus, carried on by those willing to see and act differently. The story didn't end there. It kept growing with each conversation, each connection, and each moment of courage that Meredith chose. She knew that real change was ongoing, built with steady hands and hopeful hearts. And while she couldn't predict where this journey would lead, she was ready for it, grateful for every step that had brought her to this moment. And so, surrounded by the sounds of laughter, discussion, and the promise of tomorrow, Meredith felt not only changed, but whole. A testament to what could happen when one moment opened the door to a lifetime of seeing and doing better. The years rolled on, marked by the subtle passing of seasons and the louder, more memorable moments of achievement and growth. The community center that had once been just another building in the neighborhood evolved into a hub of learning and connection, driven by the efforts of volunteers and leaders like Marcus and Meredith. One fall afternoon, the air crisp and tinged with the scent of leaves, Meredith found herself back at the community center. The large event hall was bustling with energy as people prepared for the Empathy Fair, an annual event started 3 years prior that celebrated diversity, understanding, and social action. Families browsed the booths, students led interactive activities, and local organizations set up tables to promote their causes. Jake, now in his late teens and taller than Meredith, was running one of the booths focused on youth leadership. He chatted animatedly with younger kids and their parents, the spark in his eyes a reflection of the values he'd grown up with. The flight that had once been a defining moment of fear had evolved into a catalyst for how he approached the world, with a keen awareness of fairness and the courage to act. "Mom, you've got to see this," Jake called, waving her over with a grin. He was showcasing a digital timeline of local community initiatives, many of which he had helped organize. Meredith's chest swelled with pride as she scanned the display, recognizing photos from past workshops and events she'd helped coordinate. "You've done incredible work, Jake," she said, squeezing his shoulder. He shrugged, trying to play down the praise, but the pride in his expression was undeniable. "Just following your example." Marcus, now semi-retired from the bench, dedicated most of his time to advocacy work and mentoring new leaders in the legal and social sectors. At the fair, he stood near a group of young law students, sharing stories of cases that had taught him the value of empathy in justice. His presence still commanded respect, but there was an ease to him now. A man who had not only navigated the peaks and valleys of a career in law, but had shaped the community around him. He caught sight of Meredith and raised a hand in greeting. She walked over, and they shared a smile, one that spoke of years of shared work and unspoken understanding. "Looks like we've built quite the legacy," Marcus said, gesturing to the vibrant crowd. Meredith nodded. "And it's still growing." They watched as a group of students performed a skit about inclusion, the audience laughing and applauding at all the right moments. The message was clear. Empathy wasn't just a lesson learned once. It was a practice, lived and renewed with each generation. Tom, who had initially struggled to understand Meredith's new path, had come to embrace it in his own way. He stood near a booth labeled Corporate Social Responsibility, How Business Can Lead Change, talking with attendees about his experiences integrating diversity initiatives at his company. His journey hadn't been as public as Meredith's, but it was equally meaningful. He looked up and met her eyes across the room, giving a small nod. The quiet moments they shared at home, discussing the day's work and their hopes for Jake's future, had deepened their bond. The change had strengthened not just Meredith but their family as a whole. As the event wound down, an older woman approached Meredith with a small envelope. "I wanted to give you this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a letter I wrote after attending one of your workshops last year. It changed the way I speak with my grandchildren and helped me reconnect with them. Meredith took the envelope, eyes misting. Thank you. That means more than I can say. As she opened it later that evening, the words echoed what Marcus had said years before. Change isn't about one grand act, but the many small ones that follow. Thank you for starting one of mine. That night, the Callaways sat together around their dining table. Tom, Meredith, and Jake recounting stories from the fair. Laughter filled the room, punctuated by moments of reflection. The flight that had once been a turning point had evolved into an enduring lesson, shaping not only Meredith but her family and the community around them. "Mom, you're going to keep doing this forever, right?" Jake asked, half joking. Meredith looked at him, eyes soft but firm. "As long as there's work to do, yes. And when I can't, I know you will." Jake grinned, a promise unspoken but felt in the space between them. The journey hadn't been easy, and it was far from over. But it was a journey worth taking, one that had transformed fear into courage, silence into dialogue, and moments into movements. And as Meredith sat back, listening to the hum of her family's conversation and the faint sounds of the city outside, she felt a profound sense of peace. This was the legacy she'd hoped to build. Not perfect, but hopeful, enduring, and open to anyone willing to take that first step. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Meredith's story of transformation and empathy. If you found this narrative meaningful and would like to explore more stories about growth, connection, and resilience, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future content. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that inspire change. Thanks for watching.